Captain David Carter, had spent decades in the aviation industry, earning his stripes through hard work, discipline, and an unshakable commitment to excellence. But on this particular morning, as he arrived at the airport to command a commercial flight, he was met with something he hadn't anticipated: blatant disrespect. As he approached the boarding gate, an airline staff member waved him off dismissively, telling him to wait outside like he was just another passenger. She didn't even look at his uniform. She didn't check his credentials. She simply assumed he didn't belong. But what she didn't know was that David wasn't just any pilot. He had more power than she could imagine. And within minutes, her entire world and the future of the airline itself would come crashing down. Have you ever witnessed discrimination firsthand? Tell us in the comments. And if you love stories about justice and standing up for what's right, hit that like button and subscribe, because this is one story you won't want to miss. Captain David Carter stood at the entrance of the boarding gate, the weight of the airline staff's dismissal settling in his chest. He had been in this industry for over 20 years, logging thousands of hours in the sky, commanding some of the most advanced commercial jets. Yet, here he was, being told to wait outside, like he was just another confused traveler. David was in his late 40s, a tall, well-built man with calm yet commanding energy. He was dressed in his full pilot uniform, crisp white shirt, navy blue trousers, and the gold-striped epaulets on his shoulders, a clear indication of his rank. But none of that seemed to matter to the woman behind the gate counter. Her name was Linda Walker, a mid-level airline gate agent in her mid-30s. She had worked for the airline for years and had developed a strict, no-nonsense attitude. To her, authority belonged to those she chose to recognize. And the moment she saw David standing at her desk, her unconscious bias took over. Linda barely glanced at him before making an assumption. Black man, standing near the crew entrance, probably lost, maybe looking for customer service. She didn't even let him speak before flicking her hand toward the door. "You need to wait outside, sir," she said curtly. David took a slow breath. He had seen this before. He had felt it before. The way people's eyes would hesitate when they saw him in uniform. The way their expressions shifted when they realized he was the one flying the plane. He remained calm. "Ma'am, I'm the captain for this flight. I need to check in with my crew." Linda barely looked up from her computer screen. "Pilots check in at the crew desk. This area is for employees only." David tilted his head slightly, still keeping his voice level. "That's exactly why I'm here." Linda sighed, tapping aggressively on her keyboard. "Sir, I don't have time for this. Security is going to ask you to leave if you don't follow instructions." A few passengers nearby overheard the exchange, shifting uncomfortably. Some of them glanced at David's uniform, clearly realizing the mistake being made. But no one spoke up. David exhaled, keeping his composure. This wasn't the first time he had been dismissed like this, but it might just be the last. Nearby, a junior flight attendant, a woman in her mid-20s named Rachel, noticed what was happening. She hesitated, looking between Linda and David, her expression uneasy. She had seen Captain Carter before. He was respected among the pilots. But Linda was her superior, and challenging her could put her own job at risk. David watched the hesitation in Rachel's face. He knew that if he walked away, nothing would change. If he ignored this moment, it would happen again to someone else. He adjusted his captain's hat and looked Linda directly in the eye. "This is your last chance to do the right thing," he said, his voice still calm but firm. Linda rolled her eyes, exasperated. "Sir, I don't have time for—" David pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Linda smirked, assuming he was calling someone for help. She had no idea what was about to happen. David held his phone to his ear, his expression unreadable. Linda stood behind the counter, arms crossed, her smirk growing. She had dealt with stubborn passengers before. This was nothing new. "Yeah, I have a situation," David spoke into the phone, his tone even and controlled. "One of your employees is refusing to let me board my assigned flight. I need you to handle this immediately." Linda raised an eyebrow, suppressing a chuckle. She assumed he was calling customer service, or maybe another airline employee. She had no idea that on the other end of the call was the chief operating officer, COO, of the entire airline. David had earned his way to the top, building a reputation as one of the most respected captains in the industry, but more importantly, he had powerful connections. Still unaware of what was happening, Linda turned to Rachel, the young flight attendant. "Go ahead and call security. This man refuses to leave." Rachel hesitated, glancing between Linda and David. She knew something was wrong, but before she could act, David lowered his phone and looked Linda in the eye. "You're going to regret this," he said plainly. Linda scoffed. "Oh, I doubt that." Just then, the airport security team arrived, 2 officers in uniform. One of them, a middle-aged man named Officer Jenkins, approached the counter. "What's the issue here?" Linda gestured toward David, looking completely unfazed. "This man refuses to leave. He's disturbing passengers and causing a scene." David stayed silent, watching how effortlessly she twisted the story. Officer Jenkins studied David's uniform, then frowned. "Sir, are you a pilot?" David nodded slowly. "I'm the captain of this flight." Linda let out a dry laugh. "No, he's not. He's lying." Before Officer Jenkins could respond, another voice boomed through the terminal. "Linda Walker." Everyone turned as a senior airline executive strode toward the counter, his face tight with anger. It was Michael Lawson, the chief operating officer of the airline, the very man David had just called. Linda's smirk disappeared instantly. Lawson didn't even look at her at first. His focus was on David. "Captain Carter, are you all right?" David gave a small nod, his expression calm. "I'd be better if I wasn't being denied access to my own flight." Passengers whispered among themselves, cameras now raised. The situation was unfolding faster than anyone expected. Linda swallowed hard, suddenly feeling the weight of the moment. "Sir, Lawson finally turned to her, his expression icy. "Do you have any idea who you just disrespected?" Linda opened her mouth, but no words came out. Lawson continued, his voice sharp and controlled. "Captain Carter isn't just any pilot. He's one of our most senior captains, and he was just promoted to Director of Flight Operations. That means, Linda, that he technically outranks you, me, and nearly everyone else in this terminal." The color drained from Linda's face. Passengers gasped. The security officers looked at each other in shock. Rachel, the young flight attendant, covered her mouth, barely able to process what was happening. David held back a sigh. He had expected discrimination before, but this was one of the worst he had experienced in years. Linda tried to recover. I didn't know." Lawson cut her off. "That's the problem, Linda. You didn't check. You assumed." He gestured around the terminal. "And now, the entire world is watching." Linda finally noticed the phones pointed at her, the growing number of passengers recording. David stepped forward, his voice steady. "Tell me, Linda, if I had been a white pilot standing here in this same uniform, would you have told me to wait outside?" She had no answer. The entire gate fell completely silent. Lawson shook his head. "This will not go unpunished." And at that moment, Linda realized just how badly she had messed up. Linda felt her throat tighten as the weight of the moment crashed down on her. The growing crowd, the cameras recording her every move, and the fury in the COO's eyes all made it clear this wasn't going away. David stood tall, his captain's uniform crisp and commanding. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough. He had spent years fighting against people's assumptions about him. But this was different. This time, the world was watching. Lawson, the chief operating officer, turned back to David, his expression a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "Captain Carter, I deeply apologize for this disgraceful incident. This is not how we treat our senior staff, and it is certainly not the image we uphold as an airline." David nodded, but said nothing. He wasn't going to let them brush this under the rug with just an apology. Linda finally found her voice, though it was much shakier now. "Sir, I didn't know he was the captain. I thought he was—" She stopped herself. She couldn't finish the sentence, because the truth was, there was no excuse. She had assumed. She had refused to check. And she had let her own bias dictate her actions. Lawson's jaw tightened. "And what exactly did you think he was, Linda?" The silence was deafening. Linda opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She knew there was no way to spin this, no way to erase the footage of her treating a highly respected black pilot like an intruder. David took a slow step forward, his voice calm but piercing. "You know, Linda, I didn't come here expecting a fight," he said. "I didn't come here expecting to be disrespected in front of passengers and staff, but that's exactly what happened." Linda shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tapping against the desk. "I have spent 20 years flying planes across the world," David continued. "I have led international flights, mentored junior pilots, and worked harder than most people will ever understand. But the moment you saw me standing at this gate, you didn't see a captain. You saw someone who didn't belong." Murmurs spread through the crowd as Linda's face turned bright red. "I showed you my ID," David reminded her. "I told you who I was. You refused to even look." Linda's breathing was uneven now. "I didn't mean—" David held up a hand, stopping her. "It doesn't matter what you meant. It matters what you did." Passengers began nodding, whispering among themselves. The security officers, once unsure, now looked at David with newfound respect. Rachel, the young flight attendant, finally stepped forward. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she looked directly at Linda. "I knew who Captain Carter was the moment I saw him," she said, her voice small but firm. "I was afraid to speak up because I didn't want to get in trouble." Linda's eyes widened in shock. "But I should have," Rachel continued, turning to David. "I'm sorry, Captain Carter. I should have defended you." David nodded approvingly. "It takes courage to admit when you've been silent in the face of injustice. Don't forget this moment, Rachel. Next time, speak up sooner." Rachel swallowed hard and nodded. Lawson sighed, rubbing his temples. "This situation is beyond unacceptable. Effective immediately, Linda. You are placed on indefinite suspension pending a full investigation." Linda's eyes snapped up in panic. "Sir, please, Lawson cut her off. "Save it. You don't represent this airline anymore." The murmurs grew louder as passengers recorded her downfall in real time. Linda looked around, desperate, but no one was on her side anymore. And then, the final blow. David adjusted his captain's hat, his voice steady as ever. "I've spent my life working to prove that people like me belong in places where we were told we don't," he said. "I don't need your permission to be here, Linda. I earned my place." And with that, he walked past the counter and boarded his flight. Linda watched him go, knowing her career had just crumbled before her eyes. As Captain David Carter walked down the jet bridge toward his aircraft, his steps were steady, but his mind was racing. What had just happened at the gate wasn't just about him. It was about every black pilot, every minority professional, and every person who had been dismissed, disrespected, or told they didn't belong. He took a deep breath, pushing those thoughts aside as he stepped into the cockpit, greeting his crew. The flight attendants and co-pilot welcomed him warmly, clearly aware of the tension that had unfolded outside. But David had a job to do, so he did what he always did. He focused, he led, he prepared for takeoff. Meanwhile, back at the terminal, Linda Walker stood frozen behind the gate counter, her world crumbling around her. The COO's words still echoed in her ears. "You don't represent this airline anymore." Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. She needed to fix this. There had to be a way to undo the damage. But when she opened her social media, her heart dropped. The video was everywhere. Passengers had posted the entire confrontation, and within minutes it had gone viral. Headlines were already forming. Black airline captain denied entry to his own flight. Gate agent refuses to believe he's a pilot. Airline faces backlash. After discriminating against senior black pilot, company responds to viral incident. Will there be consequences? Linda's face was plastered across news articles and social media posts. The comment sections were brutal. Unbelievable. She didn't even check his credentials. Fire her. No excuses. This is why diversity in leadership matters. People like her need to go. She felt sick. As she stood there in shock, her phone rang. It was her supervisor. She hesitated, then picked up. "Hello." His voice was cold. "Linda, clear out your desk. You're fired." Her knees nearly buckled. "Please, But the call disconnected. Linda slowly lowered the phone, her mind spinning. Just this morning, she had been so sure of her authority, so sure of her power. And now, she had lost everything. Back on the plane, David finished his pre-flight checks. As he took his seat in the cockpit, his phone vibrated. A message from the airline's CEO. "We need to talk after you land. Your leadership is needed now more than ever." David stared at the message, then out of the cockpit window. This wasn't just about one flight anymore. This was about something bigger. He adjusted his captain's hat, exhaled deeply, and gave the final command. "Prepare for takeoff." As the plane soared through the sky, Captain David Carter sat in the cockpit, his hands steady on the controls. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but inside his mind, he was still processing everything that had happened before takeoff. He had faced countless obstacles in his career, but this one stood out, not because it was new. He had dealt with racism before, but because this time the world had seen it. This time, justice was swift. When the plane landed at its destination, David stepped off to find a group of executives waiting for him. Among them was Michael Lawson, the COO, who had defended him at the terminal. "Captain Carter," Lawson greeted him. "Thank you for your patience today. The company owes you more than just an apology." David nodded, but his expression remained unreadable. "This wasn't about me. This was about a system that allows this kind of thing to happen in the first place." Lawson sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know. And we have a lot of work to do." That afternoon, David was invited to a high-level meeting at the airline's headquarters. The CEO, board members, and senior leadership were all present. A senior executive cleared his throat. "Captain Carter, we want to assure you that Linda Walker has been terminated. Her actions were unacceptable, and we will not tolerate discrimination within our airline." David leaned back in his chair. Firing one employee won't fix the problem. The room fell silent. David continued, his voice calm but firm. The problem isn't just one gate agent. It's the entire culture. How many other pilots, flight attendants, and crew members have been treated the same way I was? How many times has something like this happened without being recorded? The executives exchanged uneasy glances. David didn't stop. I have spent decades proving I belong in this industry. Why? Why do I have to keep proving myself when my qualifications should speak for themselves? Why did Linda feel so comfortable dismissing me, even when I was in full uniform? Because somewhere along the way, she learned that she could. The CEO let out a long breath. "You're right. We need to do better." Lawson nodded. "Captain Carter, what do you suggest?" David leaned forward. "I want a mandatory diversity and inclusion training program. Real training, not a slideshow people can skip through. I want better hiring practices so that people from all backgrounds can rise through the ranks. And I want a mentorship program for young pilots of color so they can have opportunities that many of us had to fight for." The CEO sat back, nodding slowly. "We can make that happen. And one more thing," David added. "I want to be directly involved in it." Lawson smiled. "We were hoping you'd say that." David finally exhaled. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a step toward change for everyone who had ever been in his shoes. With her career in ruins, she struggled to find another job. No airline wanted to be associated with her, and her name was now tied to a national controversy. One day, she sat alone in her small apartment, scrolling through the same video that had cost her everything. She winced at her own arrogance, her dismissive tone, the moment she had refused to even glance at David's ID. For the first time, she saw herself through the eyes of the world, and she didn't like what she saw. Regret sank in, not just because she lost her job, but because she had never even questioned her own bias before. She hesitated before typing out a message. It was a long shot, but she had to try. 1 month later, David was in his office at the airline headquarters when his assistant knocked. "Captain Carter, there's someone here to see you." David glanced up. "Who?" The assistant hesitated. "Linda Walker." David's expression didn't change. "Send her in." Linda entered, looking nothing like the confident gate agent from before. She was dressed simply, her shoulders slightly hunched, her face tense with uncertainty. "Captain Carter," she began, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. I know I have no right to ask for your time, but I wanted to apologize. Not because I got caught, because I finally understand what I did." David folded his arms. "Do you?" Linda swallowed hard. "I didn't just disrespect you, I disrespected every pilot who ever had to work twice as hard to be seen as equal. I let my own assumptions cloud my judgment, and I never even stopped to think about how many times someone like me had done the same thing before." David watched her carefully. He could tell this wasn't a rehearsed apology. This was real. She looked down. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't expect my job back. But I want to do better. I want to learn." For a long moment, David said nothing. Then he leaned back in his chair. "I don't believe in second chances just because someone regrets getting caught, but I do believe people can change." Linda nodded slowly. "Here's my offer," David said. "If you're serious, I'll connect you with organizations that focus on diversity and inclusion training. If you do the work, real work, then maybe, just maybe, there's a future for you in this industry again. But that's on you." Tears welled in Linda's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. David gave her a small nod. "We'll see if you mean it." As she left his office, David exhaled. Change didn't happen overnight. But this was a start. He turned back to his desk, where the plans for the mentorship program were laid out in front of him. It was time to build something better. As Captain David Carter looked over the plans for the new mentorship program, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. This wasn't just about one incident at an airport gate. It was about breaking barriers so that no pilot, no professional, and no individual would ever have to prove their worth just to be seen. He had fought his whole life to earn his place in the skies. Now, he was building a future where others wouldn't have to fight as hard. Across town, Linda Walker sat in a small classroom, listening to a diversity and inclusion lecture. She had a long way to go, but for the first time she was ready to learn. This story wasn't just about one moment of discrimination. It was about change, accountability, and the power of standing up for what's right. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly? Did you speak up, or did you stay silent? Let's talk about it in the comments below. And if you believe in equality, justice, and the power of change, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more powerful stories, because the fight for fairness doesn't end with one person. It starts with all of us. Thank you for watching. Stay strong, stand up, and never stop pushing for what's right.